Well, my name is Emily Zender, and I work for the Thomas More Society, which is a national not-for-profit law firm right here in Chicago. And we exist to restore respect in law for life, marriage, and religious liberty. So we represent some of the nation's leading pro-life and pro-family organizations, such as 40 Days for Life, Lila Rose and Live Action, Catholic bishops, priests, nuns, pregnancy crisis centers, political leaders, and all kinds of pro-life organizations across the nation. So I am going to tell you guys a little bit about some of the cases that we have been fighting, because we are not the advocates of the pro-life movement. We are the ones who protect the advocates, those who are on the front line. So we can give you kind of an interesting perspective on what's going on behind the scenes of the pro-life movement. So I'm going to talk to you about three types of cases. The first is entertaining. So these are what keep us entertained at work. The second is the lawsuits that are very serious, lawsuits that make you frightened. And then the third is going to shock you. So I'm going to follow up with telling you how you can get involved and what you should do to help the pro-life movement. So I want to ask, how many of you guys know what 40 Days for Life is? Okay, good number of you. So those who don't, 40 Days for Life, it was started just about 2 years ago, and it's a national campaign where participants pray and fast outside of an abortion clinic for 24 hours a day for 40 days. And then they also minister to women who are entering into the clinic. And this campaign has been wildly successful and is credited with saving over 6,000 children so far. I think it's about 2 or 3 years old. And then also with turning about 68 abortion workers to the pro-life movement. So they've left the abortion industry. And they are one of our biggest clients. So one of our cases for them was out in Jacksonville, North Carolina. And they were really excited, the pro-lifers there, to start a 40 Days for Life campaign. Now, they were out there praying one day, preparing for this campaign, when a police officer showed up and told them, that grassy way that you're standing on in front of the abortion clinic, you can't stand there. And they said, well, where would you like us to stand? So the police officer showed them they had to move across the street and around the corner and asked them to stand behind the abortion clinic. So that way, there would be no women that would see them as they entered the abortion clinic. So we gave them a phone call. And when we talked to them, they brought up an ordinance that was from years and actually decades ago. And we told them that was unconstitutional and didn't apply. And they gave us another excuse. And the chief of police said, well, I'm really concerned about safety. We said, oh? And he said, that grassy way that you're standing on, there's a road that goes around the abortion clinic. The road, it has a 30-mile-per-hour speed limit. And he was concerned that cars would come around the corner, they would hit the curb, fly up off the curb, and hit the pro-lifers. We said, well, that's pretty interesting. We're concerned about flying cars too. So we sued them. We took them to court and flew out to Jacksonville, North Carolina, and the moment we walked in, the opposing counsel came up to us and stopped us before we went to the judge. Because you see, we had called all the major television stations, we had called the newspapers, the radio stations in Jacksonville, and had told them about the flying cars. And before you knew it, we had the liberals and the Democrats and the Republicans all talking about flying cars. And by the end, they all agreed with our side. So when we walked in, the city stopped us, gave us an agreed order, and said, please sign this, we'll give you everything you want, and we will actually ask you to help us rewrite this law. So we did that. It was settled, and the Jacksonville, North Carolina group was able to start their first 40 Days campaign last spring. So these are ones that we see that are very entertaining. But then there are some that are not entertaining at all. You see, out in Denver, Colorado, we had a case, and there's nothing scarier than seeing a complaint that said the United States of America against you. This was what happened with Mr. Scott. You see, Mr. Scott was a long-time pro-lifer who ministered outside of Planned Parenthood. And before I tell you what his crime was for the United States of America to sue him, I'm going to tell you what he was being charged with. 10 counts of separate violations, of civil violations of the FACE Act. He was, if charged criminally, he would have to spend up to 1 year in federal penitentiary, and he was being charged a $10,000 fine. So if my assistant here would show you, I'm going to show you, they actually caught on tape what he did, what his crime was. So go ahead, Eva. Now, Mr. Scott is the one in the center of the driveway with the orange jacket on. That right there is the crime. And they had, this is actually was brought to the courts by Planned Parenthood and the Department of Justice. So they said that the fact that he stopped that car for just a second obstructed the public right-of-way and violated the FACE Act, which is the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, so that he could not, or people could not pass freely through the entrances. So they put 5 federal attorneys on this case and sued Mr. Scott in federal court. So we sent our 2 attorneys out there, and after 8 months of hard-nosed litigation, and we did discovery over Christmas, we had a pretrial hearing before the judge. The judge, after reviewing all the evidence, said that the United States of America was not reasonably likely to win, and therefore he threw it out of court. Now, this is just one example of the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Acts that are being prosecuted across the nation. This current administration has prosecuted more than any other administration has ever done. And this is not the first one that's been thrown out of court. There's been countless after countless ones thrown out of the court. We have the justice branch chastising the executive branch for abuse. And if you don't believe me, you can look up all the orders, and the things that the judges say are just appalling. Or how about our case out in Maryland? We had a group of protesters who were standing alongside of a highway, and what they were doing was they were protesting abortion. The police showed up and told them that they could not be there. They needed a permit. And they said, no, we don't need a permit. They have good lawyers. So when they began to disagree with the police arrested them, put them in the police cars, and took them down to the station. Now, there were some teenagers with them. There were 18-year-old girls. And what they did to those girls is they separated the group of them when they were in the parking lot of the police station. And they pulled them aside, and they strip searched the girls in front of the men. And then they took them to jail, held them overnight with drunkards, and would not let the teenage girls call their mothers until after midnight. Then before they threw them in jail, they strip searched the girls again. So they did it twice, and then after they released them, they filed trumped-up charges against them, but not one charge was for not having a permit. So a week later, all the charges were dropped, and we brought some charges of our own, namely the First Amendment violation and a violation of our Fourth Amendment. So this lawsuit ended up going on for about 3 years, and we found some very damning evidence during the Freedom of Information Act. We asked for them to give us all the records of the correspondence between the police officers during the time of the arrest. Now, what we found was deep police bias, where the police were exercising a heckler's veto, which means that they arrested them based on a disagreement of belief rather than for actually breaking the law. So we also found a sergeant that said, and I quote, "They can sit in jail and rot for an hour or 2 or 3 or 4. So once we found this evidence, and there were actually many other damning statements, the settlement talks happened, and our clients were able to receive not only damages, but then the Maryland State Police are now having to take a Constitution 101 class and teach them what the rights of citizens are. So these are some of the things that happen that you don't always hear about. Sometimes the media reports it, sometimes it doesn't. But let me talk about one that the media really didn't report on. I don't know if many of you heard about Kermit Gosnell's House of Horrors out in Philadelphia. And for those of you who didn't, Kermit Gosnell is an abortionist. And when his abortion clinic was inspected, they found disgusting and disturbing things that I'm not even going to mention here. So if you want to know more, just Google Kermit Gosnell. I'll just tell you that 8 of his cohorts have been charged with murder. Okay? It was so disgusting, and he is still on trial before a grand jury. He's awaiting his sentencing. And if convicted, he could receive the death penalty. So what was found in that abortion clinic kind of prompted the Illinois Department of Public Health to begin working on inspections in our abortion clinics here. Because you see, the pro-life movement has been trying for a long time to get the abortion clinics inspected. And they were slow. They said they didn't have any money. So when they noticed movement, then the pro-lifers all jumped on it, and our clients continue to press the Illinois Department of Public Health. And we credit one of them with completely shaking up the Illinois Department of Health so much that they started all of these inspections in Illinois abortion clinics. So I want to tell you what they found. This just happened a year ago, okay? The Illinois House of Horror, the Rockford Abortion Clinic. 1, 3 of 3 operating rooms inspected failed to ensure a sanitary environment. 2, gynecological canals, which are inserted during illegal abortion, were stained with a brown substance. 3, autoclave equipment used to sterilize medical instruments failed a biological testing on at least 2 occasions. This equipment should be tested weekly, and it was untested for 4 months, which means that there were unsterile surgical equipment being used on women who are having abortions. 4, failure to prevent contamination of surgical equipment with the clean and the dirty. 5, shoes were stored inside an open box of surgical gloves. 6, operating room number 1 contained a box of open surgical gloves stained with a dried brown substance. 7, ambulatory surgical treatment regulation violations that included a lack of adequate written procedures for garbage and refuse removal, insect and rodent control, maintenance of hot water, heat, ventilation, air condition, and electrical service. 8, failure to give post-operative counseling to patients. 9, improper staff review and training. 10, improper documentation and administration of drugs. 11, incomplete patient medical history and physical examination records compiled before the administration of anesthesia kept on file. So that means either they didn't do a good job of keeping file of their patient's medical history, so if anything happened to the patient and they had to go to the hospital, they had no records to give to the hospital. Or it means that they didn't actually know their history, so they had to administer anesthesia without ever knowing it, and that's why they didn't have it on file. And all of us know that improper administration of anesthesia can kill you. 12, failure to meet legal requirements for a qualified registered nurse to be present in the operating room during the procedure. Actually, there was no registered nurse even on staff. This left unlicensed and unqualified personnel to perform procedures in the abortion rooms. 13, failure to keep records as to persons accompanying those patients, suggesting that women were left to care for themselves after their abortion. 14, a failure of abortionists to have local admitting privileges. This puts the women at risk because if there was serious injury or death, they can't transport them right to a hospital. So if they did, it would be on an emergency basis, and they didn't have a relationship with the hospital, so they wouldn't know how to handle it, so it causes more time in the transfer. And if you have an emergency situation, you want to reduce that time as much as possible. So this abortion clinic was immediately suspended its license for 3 months, pending it for another inspection. On the second inspection, they found some of the things were still not resolved, so they continued to suspend it. Then they had, and we tried to intervene in the case. We sent letters. We were on every conference and settlement call. And the entire thing was done very quietly. This is all public, supposed to be public knowledge. But the whole thing was done very quietly. And then all of a sudden we heard there was going to be a settlement hearing. So we went to the settlement hearing. And what happened was it was 5 minutes long, where the abortionist attorneys came to the table and said, "We agree with what you presented us." And they said, "Okay." And we're all saying, "What did you present?" So it took us about 3 or 4 days before we finally got what was presented. And what it was is that they could reopen their abortion clinic after all 13, 14 of those violations, and as long as they paid a $9,000 fine. $9,000. So instead of opening their abortion clinic and paying a $9,000 fine, the doctor handed in his license and closed his abortion clinic for good and never paid a $9,000 fine. What was also never done in this was there was never a public notice to all the women of Rockford or the women of the state of Illinois or Wisconsin, which is also serviced by this abortion clinic, to show that this could mean that any woman who had an abortion has serious health risks or has serious disease now because of this abortion. And in case you think that this is an isolated event, or you think that these are the exceptions, I want to share with you what some of the other inspections found. The abortion clinic called Women's Aid Clinic in Lincolnwood was inspected after 15 years of not being inspected. Okay? The Rockford abortion clinic hadn't been inspected in 11 years. So after 15 years not being inspected, an inspection was prompted after a woman died after a botched abortion, and they were charged with failure to perform CPR. Let me tell you what the inspection showed. Frozen TV dinners were stored in a biohazard lab refrigerator that also held placenta or fetal tissue. They had dusty surgical equipment. There was a lack of a supervising registered nurse. And the IDPH stated that the facility had deteriorated to the point where the public interest, health, safety, or welfare would imperatively request that the facility's license be suspended immediately. This abortion clinic was fined $36,000 for failure to perform CPR after a botched abortion. When it was called and asked to pay the $36,000 fine, the woman answering the phone said, "This is no longer Women's Aid Clinic. This is Women's Aid Center. Women's Aid Clinic has no assets, and therefore, I don't think we'll be paying your fine." They use the same website. They use the same signs. They even use the same location. But they would not pay the $36,000 fine. Now we're told that the Attorney General is pursuing it relentlessly, but I have no update. This abortion clinic its license was suspended, so it can no longer do those types of surgical abortions. Let me tell you about another one in Illinois. The Dimensions Medical Center, the Illinois Department of Public Health said, "It is in a building that is structurally inadequate to provide surgical services. 2 surgical suites are too small to accommodate all the equipment necessary for modern surgical procedures." The applicant also reported flooding issues at the facility. The applicants also identified a non-functioning emergency generator system that must be replaced. Now, the emergency generator system is for when anesthesia is administered. If all of a sudden the power goes out, you can no longer administer anesthesia, and that could kill the woman. So that's why it is required that you have one of these. The flooding that I mentioned, that was a septic and sewer system, and it was described as a major sanitation issue. So this abortion clinic handed in its license voluntarily without ever having the IDPH having to come after them. So these are not the exceptions. We are investigating abortion clinics across the country where they violate laws after law constantly. So, we have ones in Indiana that are not doing reporting on minors who get abortions. We find those all across the nation. All kinds of regulatory, they're not followed. There are other abortion clinics in Illinois that haven't been inspected in over 17 years. I mean, these are what we're sending our women into. And I am sure many of you heard about Tanya Reeves, the woman who died at the Planned Parenthood just, I think it was 2 months ago. She died at the Planned Parenthood on Michigan Avenue, and we did a further investigation into it. There was no emergency 911 call that was made from Planned Parenthood to the hospital. There's no record of a call. That woman was at the abortion clinic for 5 hours after the botched abortion. So her abortion started at 11. She wasn't transferred to a hospital until 4 o'clock. They had no idea what was wrong with her when she was transferred. So that means that there was inadequate record keeping, or that they didn't talk to each other, or that they didn't know. So she died, the autopsy report said she died of a perforated uterus, and they also believe that she had a severed artery. And after the hospital performed the third abortion is when they finally figured out that she had all of this internal bleeding, and they were not able to save her. So this notion that abortion is safe, legal, and rare is very much an ill-conceived notion. So I want you to think about this, and I want you to imagine a 12-year-old girl walking into that Rockford House of Horror, and her having an abortion without ever telling her parents. That's legal in the state of Illinois. David, you want to show the map that I have up? So if you take a look at the map, all the ones in blue are states that have parental notification and or parental consent laws, meaning they have to notify a parent before they can have an abortion, or they have to get a consent from a parent before they have an abortion. Now, you can see around Illinois, it's all blue. So what happens is women and girls from out of state are brought into Illinois to have an abortion, and their parents never know. There's one of the most heart-wrenching phone calls I took where a big sister called because she's trying to fulfill the role of her mother, who had passed away, when she found out her little sister had been taken across state lines by her boyfriend's parents to have a legal abortion, and never was any consent given by her or her father, because they would never have consented. So in 1995, the Illinois General Assembly passed a law, a parental notification law. It was immediately enjoined in court, meaning that it could never go into effect. Ever since then, it has not been enforced. In 2006, the Thomas More Society got involved, and we have argued this case up the legal system. It's been remanded back down, and we finally got it all the way back up to the Illinois Supreme Court. Just 2 weeks ago, we had arguments in this case, and between now and the end of the judicial calendar, we'll have a final decision on whether or not parental notification will be enforced in Illinois.
What's the name of that case?
It's Hope v. Adams. So things like this happen because we allow it to happen. So these laws are not enforced because our public officials are not doing their jobs. Or these abortion clinics are not being inspected because our public officials are not putting people into office that should be doing these jobs. So what we should be doing is we need to get outraged. We need to get absolutely outraged that these things are happening. So I think there's an election coming up in 34 days or something. Voting is not only a right, it is a moral responsibility that we vote and vote educatedly. So we vote for the people who appoint the leader of the Illinois Department of Public Health. We vote for the people who prosecute these cases in the Attorney General's office and in the District Attorney's office. So we need to get educated on the issues and then on who are actually going to enforce these issues. And I can tell you it would help us a lot. So we don't have to go into a city where the head of the school board is allowing Planned Parenthood to come in and pass out, contraceptives to the kids and never telling the parents. So that school board official was elected by the people. So becoming educated is what everybody needs to do. So I'm going to leave you with one last thought. This January would be the 40th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. Coming into the 40th anniversary, we have never in the entire 40-year history been closer to overturning abortion as we are today. So that's why being educated and voting today is what's most important, as well as writing letters. When something like this happens, pass it all around. Don't let anybody, not hear about the Illinois House of Horrors. Write letters, Call your public officials, get educated, and vote because it can save thousands of lives.